I give floor Professor James Galbraith.
Спасибо, Мушеня. Professor Pavlenko, Rector Izborodov, my friends. It is truly a great pleasure for me to be here at the Russian State University of the Humanities. I'm here in Moscow this week to give 3 lectures on the occasion, roughly, of my father's 110th birthday, and to celebrate and advance a considerable revival, or perhaps ongoing interest in his life, thought, and his economic works that has been very much evident in the Russian Federation in recent years. So it is for me both a professional and personal pleasure to be part of this. This is, from a chronological standpoint, the second of the 3 lectures, but from a topical standpoint, it is actually the third. And what I propose to do this afternoon is to give you a relatively brief introduction to my father's as a person and to the major elements of his scholarly or his academic work, his production of books, which were to some degree scholarly, but also major landmarks of 20th century American economic thought. And then to devote a very substantial part of the lecture to the question of what happened over the 50 years, 51 years now, since the publication of the most important of those works, a book that appeared in 1967 called The New Industrial State. If I could have something to control the slides, that would be very useful. So, I want to say just a word or two about my father's origins. He did not come from an academic background. He was actually raised on a farm in Canada. His father, my grandfather, was a farmer, had an insurance company, and most importantly, a leader of the Liberal Party in southern Ontario in the early part of the 20th century. My father got his education in, such as it was, in animal husbandry, took a PhD in agricultural economics at the University of California, Berkeley, and was caught up in the early part of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal in the problems of American agriculture, which were central to the crisis, the economic crisis that was the dominant social event of that era. But that moved on in a very short period of time. He was at Harvard and then briefly at Princeton, and the war came. And during the war, he, having spent a year at the University of Cambridge and absorbed the central message of the general theory of John Maynard Keynes, he was responsible for the control of prices in the United States economy in 1941, 1942. This particular little painting by a cartoonist for the New Yorker, Edward Sorrell, depicts a meeting at the Office of Price Administration in 1942 when the high priest of economics, John Maynard Keynes, came to call on my father. You can see Keynes, you can see my father with his enormous long legs, And what are they talking about? They're not talking about high questions of economics at all. From the photograph, which is entirely fanciful, you can see that Keynes wanted to speak about the problem of prices of pigs and corn in the production of food for the war economy. He was, in short, a very practical man. He was also a political man. He had a close relationship. He had been the economics tutor to a young member of the rising Irish Catholic element in American politics, John F. Kennedy, in the 1930s, and also a friend of the man who would succeed Kennedy to the presidency, Lyndon Johnson. We went to India. Oh, this is from the 1950s. He was a chief organizer of the policy framework that became the New Frontier and later the Great Society. This is called the Democratic Policy Council. And here he is having a conversation at a meeting with the former president at that time, Harry S. Truman. So from a very early point, he was tied in at the very highest level of American politics. In the 1960s, we went as a family, as he was named Kennedy's ambassador to India. And here we are, that's me actually in the middle of that photograph, having been presented with one of the more difficult pets I've ever had to deal with, a very small leopard cub that came to us from the Delhi Zoo. You can see my father on one side, my mother on the other, my brother Peter next to me. The leopard cub, as I say, only lasted in the family for about 6 weeks, but everybody else managed to survive the experience. His major period of intellectual achievement came between the year I was born, 1952, and 1967, and through a sequence of 4 important books. They were, first of all, this one, American Capitalism, the Concept of Countervailing Power, which was published in 1952. The Great Crash, 1929, which was the product of a summer's work in the library at Dartmouth College, Dartmouth University, New Hampshire, in 1955, and was an account of what at that point was an episode of living memory, but also a universal story of the instability of capitalist finance and the foolishness of people who had speculative ambitions. This book has essentially never been out of print because the story that it tells keeps reoccurring, and it sold on the order of 50,000 additional copies with the crash of 2007. They go on here. Let's see. What am I doing? Right. Oh, sorry. We were missing something here. There was a slide to depict the Athlon Society, which appeared in 1958, and I'll show you the Russian edition, which has just appeared for the first time this year. In fact, I have a copy of it right here. Общество изобилия. And the book that appeared in 1958, which catapulted him to the first rank of American intellectuals, and consisted of in large part, of a philosophical criticism of the conventional economic thinking of the time, in particular aimed at the idea that economics was a doctrine of scarcity, as it seemed to my father that this was a fundamental fallacy in what the emerging period of the post-war United States, or West generally, that the problem of scarcity was a conceit that should give way to the problems of the environment, the problems of human rights, and particularly women's rights, the problem of social balance, that is to say, of achieving an effective balance between the selling and marketing, design, and production of goods for private individuals and households, and the needs of the society as a whole to have a decent environment in which those goods can be enjoyed, including both the infrastructure, the roads, the parks, the educational facilities, and the larger environment, the air, the water, that we all breathe together. So this book raised a set of questions which became, in some sense, a landmark in the development of the discussion of social direction in the United States and in the West generally in the 1960s. It was never, at that time, quite considered suitable for publication in the Soviet Union, which is why its publication this year in Russia for the first time is, I think, a significant intellectual event. It was also a book that had a wide reach and gathered respect in many, many places, and I show you this particular cover, which, as you can see if you look closely, is made of used matchsticks held together with shellac. And the cover was made in prison by 3 professors of economics of Greece who were being held by the fascist junta following the coup d'etat in 1967. And so they took their time in the prison camp to take this particular book, I'm sure others as well, and to create a work of art out of the materials that were available to them. I have it in my library and consider it to be one of my most precious possessions because it imbues this particular work with a certain symbolic importance which I find completely unforgettable. So I want to go on to talk about the book that I think did the most to define my father's vision of the world economy. This is the New Industrial State in the original cover that appeared as it appeared in 1967. My father wrote in the preface to this book that his previous work, the Athlon Society, was the window, and that this book, The New Industrial State, was the house into which he originally saw via that window. The book was originally drafted in the 1950s, in the late 1950s, and when we went to India in 1961, my father stored it in a bank vault where it stayed for 2.5 years until our return in 1963. It was then finished for publication in 1967, which was a time of great tumult in American political and economic life. A time, on the one hand, of prosperity, high rates of employment, essentially full employment. A time, basically the last time of American economic dominance in the world, and the middle of Lyndon Johnson's push toward what he called the Great Society, so a time of social reform, a time of social upheaval, of protest, and a time of war, of the war in Vietnam, which was splitting American society along lines that have yet to be fully repaired. So it was in many ways a peak year for the United States of corporate power, of military hubris, of post-war prosperity, and of social progress. It's also a moment when the American way had its peak reputation in the world, both as a model and as a threat. In Western Europe, in France, for example, the author Jean-Jacques Servan-Schreiber wrote a book called Le Défi Américain, the American Challenge, which expressed this ambivalence of mood toward the country which had assumed the leading role on the western side of the Cold War. The Yankees, he wrote, had a superior corporate form, and it was going to take over in Europe and the world. But the new industrial state was also a fundamental challenge for the economics profession. It expressed the imperative of placing organization, of studying the way in which organizational structures are put together and how they function, of placing that topic over and above the traditional economic preoccupation with markets. For it was organization, ruthless, efficient, large scale, and only organization that permits the division of tasks required for the deep application of technology. That say, permits the scientific and engineering knowledge that people acquire in the study of chemistry or physics or metallurgy or whatever it might be, electrical engineering, to be applied effectively to the construction of a complex product for eventual use either by consumers or by businesses. It's only organization that permits the long lead times that are required for product design in the modern world. And there's a marvelous example of the difference between the Ford Model T of the early 1900s and the Ford Mustang of the early mid-1960s. That opens this book. It's only organization that permits corporations to manage the demand for specific products, both through advertising and through design, and through less salubrious methods such as selling products that are addictive for their consuming public. So that sales can be assured and renewed. And it's only organizations acting together that can, working with government, affect the management of total demand, of aggregate demand, so that investment and also scrapping, the boom and the bust of the business cycle, can be done in a coordinated way. In general, my father argued, organization permits comprehensive control of a planning system, of the corporate planets, around which rings of small and medium businesses revolve. For those who continued to insist, as academic economics did, that the ideal type was the small, perfectly competitive business enterprise that cannot influence price and has no particular influence over its product either, in other words, the small peasant farmer essentially selling onto an unregulated market, my father expressed a kind of amused contempt for this idea. He wrote, "The person who sets out to study buildings in Manhattan on the assumption that all are alike will have difficulty passing from the surviving brownstones to the skyscrapers." You might see some of that same issue in Moscow today if you go look at Moscow City. "And he will handicap himself even more if he imagines that all buildings should be like brownstones and have load-bearing walls, and that the others are abnormal." The idea of the new industrial state was to describe the economy, American economy, along with its power structures, its mitigating and countervailing forces, also its government and the military-industrial complex, as they were. The portrait is not on balance hostile. It's not Baran and Sweezy or Bowles and Gentis. It's not a neo-Marxist or Marxist analysis. To Galbraith, to my father, the system had advantages and disadvantages, flaws and challenges, but the available alternatives did not include utopia to be achieved at low social cost. He was not a utopian thinker. He was a practical man. Realism in analysis was what was required if you were going to be realistic about solving the problems that you actually have. There would never be a day when all problems would be solved. And he did not write such foolishness as Irving Fisher had in 1929 when he wrote that stocks had reached a permanently high plateau, or Robert Lucas wrote in the early 2000s that economics had solved the problem of depressions. It was sufficient to work toward the good, not necessarily even the great, but the good society. And to this end, all practical measures were what was required. We're now 50 years later. And it's not so easy to reconstruct, and it's also not easy to overstate the effect that the new industrial state had on American political culture and the threat to established economics. It was on the bestseller list for over a year in the United States, sold widely around the world. It was the big book by the most widely read economist since, I would argue, since the death of Marx. And speaking from a place of academic prestige, that is to say Harvard, in the most powerful country of the moment. You might have thought that it would have a lasting impact. But in fact, what happened was the economics profession reacted to it as if they had been hit by a dangerous virus or bacterium. They inoculated themselves and they took every possible antidote, and they went to bed with a fever and waited until the fever passed. And then they emerged and said, oh, really, nothing much here. It's not really economics. And they went on for the next 30 or 40 years, continuing to preach the same doctrines that they were preaching before, in which the ideals were perfectly competitive markets and freely adjusting prices. The results are now evident around the world, but I want to talk about how they evolved. Results, in fact, were of course felt with particular harshness here and in other countries that had been in the orbit of the Soviet Union when the socialist regimes collapsed. It was rather than making an effective adjustment to a system that was functional, they attempted an adjustment to a system that never could exist and ended up with, as you all know, the radical concentration of wealth and the radical collapse for a time of industrial capacity. There was within economics a prodigious pretense to the status of science, the deepened commitment to impenetrable algebra, and a consequent attempt to read my father out of the economics profession. All of these things meant that this particular book disappeared from view. For a half century, economics has maintained a discipline, what we might call Cordon Sanitaire, around the ideas and work of my father. It's not that he is engaged and rejected, he's largely simply ignored. And the sting of his prose style and his gift for image and metaphor are taken to detract rather than to add to his bona fides as an economist. Real economists are supposed to be dull, as their students know, and in this they largely succeed. As a result, this book, as I say, largely disappeared from view. When my father passed away in 2006, it was unavailable. It has since enjoyed a modest revival. It is now available in this edition from Princeton University Press. I provided a foreword for it, and it is available in Russian, as it has been, I think, fairly continuously in this edition, which I only just found the cover of on the web this morning. So what I want to talk about now is what happened in the years that followed my father's portrait of the dominant American Western economic form as a let's say, archetype for the economic system of that time, of the late 1960s. A system which had emerged in the aftermath of the Second World War, was a product in part of the New Deal, industrial mobilization, and which by the late 1960s was considered to be the model of stable business organization in the West. I think there are a range of things that can be called to our attention in this matter, and I've got a list of them here, and I want to go over them briefly and then talk about each of them in turns. The first, coming just 4 years after the new industrial state was published in 1967, was the beginning of the breakdown of the global financial order that had been created in 1945 at the end of the Second World War. The so-called Bretton Woods system, after a small town in New Hampshire, which had established the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, but that had most importantly established a system of stabilization of exchange rates and therefore adjustment of the advanced economies to each other so that they could all grow at a reasonably coordinated way and in a way where the purchasing power of their currencies would be protected by international cooperation. Richard Nixon broke up the Bretton Woods system by breaking the link between the dollar and gold, imposing export quotas and taking other measures in August of 1971. In 1973, we moved to the system that has existed ever since of market-adjusted exchange rates, which has produced a considerably greater amount of instability and a much greater amount of debt dependence in the world at large, debt dependence and debt crisis in the world at large. Second event, which followed on to the first, was the oil crisis of 1973, which raised the possibility that the United States would be facing resource constraints that would greatly hamper the competitiveness of the industrial system. The third, ongoing through this period, but very clear by the end of the 1970s, was the rise of alternative industrial systems in Japan, later in Korea, and by the 1990s, early 2000s in China, all of which had much more stable reliance on major corporate forms than was the case in the United States. All of which in some ways more Galbraithian than the Galbraithian system in America. In the early 1980s, a revolution, the counter-revolution, that was fostered by the policies initially of Paul Volcker, chairman of the Federal Reserve from 1979, greatly raising interest rates, financial shock, and Ronald Reagan cutting taxes, taking other measures to destroy the countervailing power of trade unions and other stabilizing forces in the American economy. The world debt crisis of 1981, which continued for a long time, and that led, in part, contributed certainly to the collapse of the USSR at the end of the first Cold War. And the consequence of all of this in the United States, of what I'll call the rise of a bi-coastal techno-financial state. A nation whose dominant economic powers are the financial sector located substantially on the East Coast and the technology, aeronautics, informatics, military industrial sector located largely on the West Coast, with an enormous vacuum of economic prosperity in between, an enormous problem of prosperity in particular regions and stagnation in others, including regions that were once the leading part of the American economic system. And this led, I would argue, almost inevitably to the mechanisms that produced the great financial crisis of a decade ago, which was essentially rooted in the United States, but reverberated around the world. So those are the essential aspects, and I want to spend the rest of this talk essentially saying a little bit more about each of them. first of all, what was Bretton Woods? It was the overarching financial framework of an American system, and a system that gave to the United States a degree of hegemony in the West that had been fostered by the financial effects of both world wars, the fact that the U.S. was the major creditor of the First World War, the fact that gold reserves were concentrated in the United States, the fact that the British and the French empires were bankrupted by the First and especially by the Second World Wars, and so the United States ended up as the anchor of the post-war Western system as the Cold War developed. This architecture was predicated on an American industrial supremacy that lasted for a long time but could not last forever, that could not forever withstand the recoveries that we fostered, but that were also developed by a great deal of indigenous capacity and energy in Germany and in Japan. It could not withstand also the process of multinationalization of U.S. industries, industrial corporations, nor the slide into permanent trade deficit that the United States experienced, especially with the costs of the Vietnam War in the 1960s. So as I said earlier, it was only 4 years after the publication of the new industrial state that Nixon closed the gold window, devalued the dollar, declared himself, quote, a Keynesian in economics, just as this problem was known as stagflation, inflation, and unemployment, previously thought impossible to occur at the same time, undermined the confidence of American economists in their ability to control and manage the macroeconomy. I have to say my father was happy because he felt vindicated in one of his longstanding policy recommendations when Richard Nixon imposed wage and price controls in August of 1971. But this was just one aspect of a basically very short-term effort to control the instabilities that were being introduced by a radical change in American economic policy. The oil shocks of 1973 and 1979 were linked to political events, but I think political events, the Arab-Israeli War of 1973 and the revolution in Iran in 1979 were not the central thing. They were more precipitating factors insofar as oil producers were suffering significant falls in their purchasing power owing to the fact that oil was priced in dollars and the dollar had fallen in the wake of Nixon's policies. However, what they were experienced as in the United States was as inflation, generalized inflation, which in turn led to a policy of a policy reaction that was devolved onto the central bank, onto the Federal Reserve. And in this period, the 1970s, the United States Federal Reserve started raising interest rates. Raising interest rates which had been maintained largely stable for a generation or longer. They were basically very low in the Depression. They were kept low in the Second World War, and they stayed low through the 1950s, which meant that American households could borrow for mortgages and American businesses could borrow for capital requirements with very predictable economic consequences. From the 1970s, interest rates became a policy tool. Monetarism, the notion that the central bank should have the principal responsibility for inflation, became a dominant policy doctrine, and things became radically more unstable. The effect of this was a sequence of industrial crises, 1970, 1974, 1980, in the Northeast, in the Midwest, which unleashed an industrial decline in the United States, from which we are still suffering and whose political consequences I'll come to shortly. What also happened here was that with higher priced fuel and higher domestic interest costs, industrial advantage moved at an accelerated rate to Japan and to Germany, and those countries began exporting industrial products, automobiles in particular, steel, aluminum, and so forth, to the United States. So while the planning system that my father described in the United States was in decline, it was flourishing in Germany and Japan, both of which also had far less by way of military expenditures and were therefore able to devote their domestic resources to industrial development and to the promotion of stabilizing social democratic institutions, just as these were being eroded in the United States. Korean case is a little bit different because Korea was a frontline state, but it had excellent access to the US market, and it developed a policy of dual-use industrialization, heavy industrialization, both to face North Korea, but also to provide it with an extraordinary position in shipping and other, and eventually automotive and machine industries in the world market. All of these things essentially under the US security umbrella worked to displace American industrial advantage. And then came the great financial counter-revolution, Paul Volcker's 20% interest rates in 1979 and 1981, which blasted the industrial corporations and crushed the trade unions. I was beginning my career as a professional economist in the government, in the Congress of the United States in this period, and it was exceedingly apparent. I was working for a congressman from Wisconsin, that region of the country was being targeted to an exceptional degree and harmed irreversibly by these policies. Was something that was clear to us. We were, of course, attempting to resist the policies, but all of the policy, and this was shock therapy in the United States 13, 14 years before it was applied here in Russia. And there was essentially the same consequences, deindustrialization, and an economy in which the position of oligarchs, of particular individuals, was greatly advanced as the shells or the weakened structures of industrial corporations were encouraged to pay out ever larger shares of their cash flow and ever larger shares of their ownership to the managing directors, to the corporation chiefs, a kind of American nomenclatura privatization. In the end of that period in the United States, you had a wave of apparent prosperity, but it had a very different foundation from what had been before. The foundation was not wages and unions and, let's say, working class communities, but the extension of credit from the financial institutions. And so through the 1980s and into the 1990s and right up to 2000, the United States economy, after an initial recession, continued to grow and was apparently prosperous. But the underlying basis for that growth was very different from what it had been before, much more fragile, and subject, in the end, to a great destabilization, which I will come to momentarily. Now, you know probably as well as I do, perhaps better, how the same intellectual forces which neglected the force of organization and built up or relied on the notion of individuals and businesses interacting in perfectly competitive markets with freely adjusting prices and policymakers who are concerned only about the stabilization of the general price level. The economy itself allowed to find its own level, and whatever employment level that resulted be considered full employment. How this played out in here and in other parts of the world as the Milton Friedman's and Friedrich von Hayek's became the dominant intellectual forces in the economics profession. There were exceptions. I mentioned that Germany was an exception. And we see in the fact that Germany was an exception, the fact that the German industrial base continued to grow into the European Union, into the period of the European Monetary Union following 1999, to the point where Germany today holds a dominant position in the industrial structure of Europe. And that's evident from the fact that Germany runs enormous surpluses every year, which are causing problems for all of the other countries of the Eurozone, but are assuredly a source, or assuredly have their source in the fact that the German industrial organization still follows the principles that were outlined by my father in 1967 and that largely were built up in the post-war occupation after 1945 on the principles and ideas of the American New Deal in large part. And the other great exception is Japan. And a third great exception is China. And I've discovered, both recently and from my own work in China in the 1990s, that the Chinese policymakers were very close students of my father's work, even in the period of Maoist economics, because they needed a pragmatic approach to the problem of the stabilization of prices. Under communism, even the slightest deviation in the price level or the price of key consumer goods, cooking oil, rice, wheat, corn in China, was likely to provoke a severe reaction from the general public, hoarding, disruption of market supplies. And this was considered to be deeply problematic, was deeply problematic for the Chinese government. When I advised the Chinese government for 4 years, from 1993 to 1997, first thing that happened when I got there was the people I was working with asked me to sign copies of my father's books. So it was clear that there too was a system in which his influence was openly acknowledged, at least at the highest levels of policymaker. This was not true in the United States. The United States moved on. We placed our faith in technology and in finance. We allowed our political system to be come in the thrall of Wall Street, of financial experts. I have to say, I met Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev in 2010, and I said, Mr. President, when Homer returns to write the story of this epic, he will say that the Russian mathematicians came to Wall Street in the early 1990s with the gift of financial risk assessment models. They were received with joy. They went to work, and in 20 years they destroyed the whole place. He said, well, I've been accused of worse. But the story underlying this, I think, is a true story, that we came to the view that you could run an advanced capitalist economy through the unqualified power of bankers, placing everything, including government, in a subordinate position. And we discovered that this is a bit like running a nuclear reactor without coolant or a car without oil. It doesn't work for very long. There's a tendency for the system to blow up. And what happened in the 2000s was that the system ran very hot on the basis of the issuing of mortgages that the lenders knew would not be paid to people who should never have been qualified for mortgages, and the packaging and selling of those mortgages according to mathematical models which said that they were riskless, to naive investors who took the reputation of the ratings agencies and the investment banks at face value, many of them in Europe. And at a certain point, this system melted down completely, leaving us where we are. The United States remains an enormously powerful country and economy in the world. Its power remains rooted in the almost residual willingness of the rest of the world to park financial assets in the United States, to hold United States government, treasury, bonds, and bills. It's a power which has, I think, an exhausted military component, one which has been demonstrated to lead to futility and loss in Afghanistan and Iraq. It's a power which has some residual basis in information technology and energy technology, but very much less than used to be the case in the core industries that supply capital goods and consumer goods to the world population. And that power seems to me to be of a very fragile type. So it does seem to me that we've suffered an enormous loss by following an economics that decided to reject the common sense and the practical wisdom and the complex view, the complex portrait of the world as it was that my father offered 50 years ago. But that the experience of those who did not reject his views shows that there is still a useful kernel in those views. Not so much because they describe the world as it is now, but because they have an essential element of open-mindedness, of capacity to see things as they are and to attack problems as they are in the way which is most likely to find a useful path forward. And I could give you many, many examples of my father attempting to do this and doing it in his engagement in public policy. But his most important contribution is to leave this as a model of a way of thinking that I believe economics or whatever discipline succeeds economics in our approach to the problems of the social and political and institutional and economic world could well take very profitable advantage of. So with that, thank you very much indeed for your attention.
Mr. Galbraith, thank you for your lecture. It was very interesting and useful. I have a question. How do you think will the role of the state increase or decrease in economic? Thank you.
Could you say that again, just one more time?
Will the role of the state will increase or decrease in economic?
The role of the state, will it increase or decrease? You mean in general terms? I would put it this way, that, and I think it's important to have a unifying framework for considering the relationship of the state to the rest of the economy. And the typical vision, which I think is implicit in your question, is that these are two opposed forces, the state or the market. And then you can have some functions which are moved from the state to the market, functions which move from the market to the state. But the general pressure has been to say, reduce the state, increase the market. I would think that this is perhaps not the most useful way to conceptualize the question. I would argue that societies share the same properties as machines, biological systems, that they have resources which they process through systems, and that processing has to be regulated. And that without the regulation, things are going to collapse. If you're my age, it is a very good idea to keep taking your medicine to regulate your blood pressure. Perhaps not so much of a problem for you now, but you will discover this in decades ahead. It's just a bad idea to let your blood pressure get out of hand. If you have a car, it's a bad idea to run it without oil, without air in the tires, without water in the radiator. These are regulatory mechanisms. Right? They keep the machinery operating within its design limits. So they're respecting, if you like, the very basic laws of thermodynamics. Now, in a society, it's the same way. It's the same way. A market which runs without regulation is going to have a problem of fraud, of crime, of deception, of dirty dealing, of violence. Right? It's going to be a market, and there are many such markets, in which the dominant force is not an orderly exchange between parties of equal power, but a mafia operating against a weak or defenseless clientele. It's a market in which people are going to compete in all kinds of ways which are not legitimate. They're going to run down the quality of their goods. They're going to substitute toxic substances for safe substances, cheap products for better ones. They're going to take advantage of shortages to jack up prices. And they're going to find all kinds of ways in financial contracts to deceive and create situations in which something looks very good right now but turns into a disaster in a year, 2 years, or 3 years. We had this in the United States. We had people getting mortgages which were fixed for 2 or 3 years, and then for the third or the second year, or the fourth year onward, the payment would double or triple. And the buyers were told, well, you can always refinance. But you couldn't refinance if the price of the house didn't continue to go up. So the moment prices stopped rising, all of those mortgages failed. And all of the people who bought packages of those mortgages ended up with worthless assets, or assets that depreciated very quickly. And the world was in a financial crisis in a very short period of time. Why did this happen? Because we deregulated the financial system. We cut back on supervision of the financial system. And we decriminalized the financial system in the sense that we allowed it to be known to bankers and various people operating in those sectors that they could do whatever they want and they would not end up having to face a judge and a jury. And of course, what happens when you do that is that the player who is most aggressive manages to take advantage of it. The players who continue to play honestly, and there are many of them, they fall behind. The stock market rewards the people who report high growth even if it's fraudulent. So my argument would be that the government has an indispensable role. The exact scale we can talk about. But I would argue that we have weakened social insurance in the United States, and that it needs to be strengthened. Health insurance. Insurance is a very valuable public role because it's much easier to provide it for everybody than to have a lot of little companies trying to find the best clients. Quality control is very valuable. We face environmental challenge, and climate change in particular requires us to have a regulation so that we don't burn up the planet. These things are all indispensable. And perhaps that one is the closest to giving you an actual answer. If we come to deal with climate change, we're going to have public authorities that make it possible to enforce and make effective a solution to that problem.
Thanks, very interesting. Please, the next question, or do you have some comments? Okay. The students for the first line. In the first line, please.
Mr. Galbraith, good afternoon. My name is Nadezhda. I'm a fourth-year student. And so I'm not a specialist in the field of economy.
Don't rub it in.
States of America. And maybe my question will be quite simple, but nonetheless.
That's always a very dangerous thing. when someone says my question is going to be simple, my warning signals go up. Go ahead, but lean into the microphone so I can hear you clearly.
So, what do you think? What extent can be the U.S. public debt be boosted or expanded? To what extent?
Could you just say that one more time and perhaps right into the microphone? So,
Yes,
yeah. So
to what extent can be the U.S. public debt boosted?
Oh, the United States public debt. Yes, thank you for that question. The U.S. is in a position which is not unique in the world, but it is exceptionally strong insofar as the United States government borrows in its own currency, so it borrows in dollars, and it issues an asset that the rest of the world has, up till now, been willing to hold and to accumulate as a reserve. Not only United States citizens, United States banks, but reserve banks everywhere and lots of private individuals. And so, the first question is, will they continue to do that? The answer to that is, I don't know, but I've seen no sign that they prefer any other asset substantially, not the euro, not the British pound, not the Japanese yen or the renminbi. And of course, we see exceptions. We see that the Russian Federation has sold dollars and bought gold, right? So that's something. But that's so far just a very small sign of both self-protection and reaction to an aggressive policy on the part of the U.S. Second question is, what will happen if a large part of the world decides it doesn't want to hold U.S. treasuries, U.S. government assets, and dollar assets? And the answer to that is the dollar will decline in relation. So this would be a problem internally for the U.S. population. Price of fuel, price of food, that kind of thing would go up. And it would be a political problem in the United States. But it would not be a bankruptcy problem for the government. The government, so long as those assets is basically issuing dollar assets, it will always be able to pay the interest. Because that's just a question of chopping up a number on a computer. There's no material basis for it. It's just you look at your account and the number is bigger than it was before. And not by much, because the interest rates are very low. So my view is, I've always said that there was a remark that was attributed to the Iron Chancellor Otto von Bismarck late in his life in the 1890s, and it was roughly that almighty Providence has a special place for drunks, fools, and the United States of America. And that seems to be holding true so far. We'll see how long.
Please?
One of the most economically and, of course, technologically developed. And that's why I have a question. What were the most important decisions that led to this result, to this economic growth, maybe, in these countries, of course?
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, my father had at least some role in post-war Germany. The first thing was that he was closely involved. He was a director of the Strategic Bombing Survey, which assessed the extent to which U.S. and British strategic bombing had affected German war production. The answer to that was not very much. He was also involved early on in the transition to a return to self-rule in Germany in 1946 or so. And had many close relationships with people who were in the architecture and in management of the Marshall Plan. Many of whom were veterans of wartime economic management in Washington. I think it's a fair observation that the post-war German economy, the industrial core, up until the Hartz reforms in the early 2000s, maintained very consistently a balance between the interests of the corporations, the interests of the unions. They had big unitary banks who had long-term relationships with the industrial sector, and they have maintained and advanced their technological position over time. And all of this is really a sign that this organizational form, which is very much that described in the new industrial state, where it has not been destabilized by larger policies, which is the case in the US, has continued to be a very successful form. Japan also has a strong relationship to the post-war industrial structure that was advanced by the New Dealers who came to Japan in 1945. And also by Japanese economists who were strongly, let's say, influenced by that tradition. In particular, I think of someone like Shigeto Suru, who was a very important Japanese economist of the post-war period. And so you can see that to me is the important thing. Having industrial corporations, but surrounded by institutions that regulate, that supervise, and that balance some of their influence. And that's the characteristic that the US lost after the 1970s.
Questions?
Yeah, thank you for this fascinating lecture. I'm Anna Kostova, a student of international relations, and I would like to ask you one question. Speaking about the information processes, from your
Sorry, about the
information processes.
information processes, yes.
From your point of view, how they will influence towards the world economy in the next decade? Thank you.
How will you mean information technologies?
Processes.
Processes. Can you explain to me what you mean by processes? I'm sorry.
I mean the social media, how they will influence the world economy. Thank you.
Okay. Well, a couple of things here. One which I could have emphasized more in the body of my lecture is to consider the industrial structure, the corporate structure that gives us these information processes, which are basically companies, Facebook, Google, Twitter, and so forth. This grows out of a process of financialization of scientific and technical development. And it's very important. In the 1940s, 50s, 60s, into the 70s, scientific research in the corporation was part of a laboratory structure that was like the government laboratories. So we had Bell Labs, for example, as the research arm of AT&T. That's where the transistor was invented. Very important, integrated circuit, very important. But those enterprises became separate companies in the 70s and 80s, independently capitalized, and they moved from being parts of industrial corporations to being their own companies. Fairchild Semiconductor, Intel, and then Apple, and then Microsoft, and then Google, and then Facebook, and so on and so forth. And they're part of this sort of evolving industrial, technical, financial system that I call, that I refer to here. That's what I'm talking about when I say a techno-financial state. Now, what is their consequence? Well, for the moment, I think what you are seeing is a tension between the enormous facility that these enterprises give for communication, right, all over the world, but especially the ability to basically subsume all forms of personal communication and bring everybody into a framework. So whether you're a popular person depends upon how many likes and friends and so forth you have. My students tell me about this all the time. I'm not on Facebook, I'm not on Twitter, I'm not on social media at all. If you want to contact me, email is as far as I'll go. But I'm an old fogey. Everybody I know is in this thing. That's the advantage. The disadvantage is you're subject to their policies as far as what you can see or can't see, what comes up when you type a search term in, what is or is not fake news, and you're subject to surveillance. And you're subject to their intellectual property policies. I take it when you sign on to Facebook, you basically give them rights to everything you post. My view is that this is probably quite like a credit cycle, quite like when a bank goes and starts making loans to people who won't pay. It's something that will end at some point in a crash. That's my view. I can't think that these very short, very, very recent developments, which are coming quite fast, will be durable. Because I can't think that people really want to exist in a kind of pool of communication in which they are constantly being watched over. And then you'll start thinking, well, if I really want to say this, maybe I better have a meeting and just have a quiet session to talk with my friends. Put all the cell phones and telephones into refrigerators so they can't overhear you. That strikes me as the way things will go. That we'll see this develop and then we'll see it recede. I could be wrong. But the fact is already you see so much reaction to something like Twitter because it becomes a very hostile environment. And reaction to Facebook because who wants to give all their personal property, personal details to Mark Zuckerberg? I wouldn't. That would be, so I'm skeptical that we will see this as the dominant phenomenon in the next generation. Your generation is the lucky one, you get to live through it.
First of all, thank you for your lecture. That was very informative. I want to hear your opinion on some topics. I've heard much that the United States of America will more and more interact with the Asian region and that the center of economic power will over time move to the Asian region. What do you think about that?
Exceedingly interesting question. And it has been true for some decades that apart from Canada and Mexico, the U.S.'s largest trading partners have been in the East, Japan and China. And really it's important to treat the two of them as a very closely connected entity because much of what comes from China actually originates in Japan. So that relationship exists. It is in some contradiction to the U.S.'s political and military relationships, which are obviously predominantly with Europe. And it's also in contradiction with what you might call the U.S., if you're uncharitable, backyard or neo-colonial sphere in South America. What is going on now is a very interesting experiment in attempting to slow down, if not reverse, the process of integration, especially with China. And that is, I mean, it's clearly the objective of the trade policy that's been adopted by the Trump administration. Do I think it will succeed? Not to the benefit of the United States in the long run, I don't know. I think that the Chinese can survive very well under whatever regime we choose to impose. They do not, if they needed the United States as a market at one point, it's not the case that they still need it. And this is an independent country which is not going to be, if it wasn't going to fall under the pressures put on by the United States in the middle of the Cold War, it's certainly not going to fall now. So I think we are engaging in what is a foredoomed effort and will probably accelerate the integration of the Eurasian landmass if it has any effect at all, and that will not be to the long-term benefit of the United States. So that would be the answer I would give you on that.
Okay. Sorry, sorry, Professor Akimushkina. Let me give to the student and then your comments and your question, please.
Thank you for the lecture. It was quite interesting and informative. You mentioned South Korea. It's quite well-known fact that economic development of the South Korea is often called current economical miracle. Do you think were the ideas of your father used as the base groups for the South Korean economical strategy between 60s and 80s? And what's your position about the reasons of such success?
The success of South Korea is a couple of things, I think, primarily. One is that beginning in the middle 1970s, they invested heavily in core industries, which then developed technically very rapidly. So they were transforming the product mix very, very quickly and deepening their access to the markets of the big consumer economies, the US and others. And this continues. It's also the case that South Korea benefited from its status as a frontline state. Because when financial crisis hit in Latin America in the early 1980s, for example, credit did not cease to South Korea. Why? Too risky. So it was actually a political decision. 1997, okay, they got hit very hard. But by that time, they had, I think, a much greater resilience than was the case in the early 1980s. And so they were basically recovered. What's going to happen now is very interesting because it's a country which has become politically much more mature, stable, and is taking the initiative in the reconciliation in the Korean Peninsula. And so I think the future of, we think about the future of Korea, the current political alignment isn't going to be what is going to be the case in 15 or 20 years. I mean, already we have an agreement that they're going to be attempting, and I imagine they will be allowed to do this, to jointly host the Olympics in, 10 or 15 years. So this is, we're living in a moment when the Korean future is being framed. And I think in a way which is one of the few areas in the world where things are moving in a hopeful direction. And that's because they're positive players on all three sides of the North Korean, of the DPRK. This is South Korea, China, and Russia all have a common interest in settling this in a way which produces the most stable and prosperous solution. It seems to me this is hopeful. So I don't have hope for a lot of the world, but this is one corner of it that I think where the problems can be resolved.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, and Professor Akimushkina.
My name is Irina Akimushkina. I'm a doctor in history, but PhD in history, and I teach at the Department of discussion, but my question is how you can define what is globalization in the economy, because there are different policies, and I would like to from you. And thank you so much for your lecture, because your lecture, I think my students and I will learn a lot during your lecture.
Well, thank you very much for those very kind words. And the question was, how do I define globalization?
Yes, in economy especially, because there is in culture, in politics, and everything is interrelated, but
Yeah.
in economy, as economists.
Yeah, it's a very slippery term. I would argue, and you as a historian, I think will probably agree, that the world has been global for an awfully long time. The first wave of globalization was the Columbian exchange in the beginning in the late 1400s, and then you've had successive waves of it as communication technologies developed. The modern use of it, I suppose, really has to do with the end of the First Cold War and the integration of the former Soviet space and Eastern Europe into the economies of the rest of the world, along with the breakdown of the barriers that existed before 1976 between the West and China. So now that's where the fundamental barriers were that have not entirely gone away, but have largely gone away. And I would argue that this is not an unmitigated blessing. That to the extent that globalization has been limited by national or regional mechanisms of stabilization and control, capital controls in China, for example, that's a good thing. It's a good thing because an entirely globalized economy is an economy that is where all the risks are shared and uncontrolled. And so, particularly an economy which is globalized but not globally governed, runs into the problem that we were discussing at the beginning of this, which is you have a system where the forces are outside of our ability to stabilize them. A nice metaphor for this is an oil tanker. If you look at the construction of an oil tanker, it is always built up in compartments. Why is that? It's to keep the oil from forming waves that rolls around inside the hold of the ship and causes it to tip over, which it will otherwise do. And so the world economy is a similar sort of thing. It needs to be controlled and needs to be stabilized in ways which are basically reinforced by a solid architecture. And that's not just true of economics, it's true of politics as well. It's obvious that we built institutions to try to do this after the Second World War through the United Nations. Those institutions are weak relative to what we need, and we're running a lot of risks because it's possible that people will take risks that will prove to be, let's say, that will pay off very badly. This was something, by the way, that my father was always concerned about through his entire life, and really from the experience of the Second World War and through the nuclear age. It was never far from his mind that this is, we run risks with weapons of incalculable power that are under very imperfect control. And that this is a matter which we have to, as all scholars, particularly those who do history, international relations, politics, and economics, have to constantly keep in mind, because it's not just I mean, it's possible for conflicts that develop out of economics or other causes in our world to lead to catastrophes, which we all know are there, but we have a tendency to forget just how close they are. My father never forgot. He never forgot what had happened at the end of the Second World War and what he witnessed in Dresden and Japan. And that's something that he was with him right to the end of his life. I also want to say, by the way, that on the question of social media and so forth, he was never even on email, but he was an example of how you can maintain communication the old way. He answered every letter on the day he received it, and he built up an archive of paper, which by the end of his life amounted to 750,000 pages. And they are all now in the Kennedy Presidential Library, cataloged, archived, and open to the public with no restrictions. So one of the great letter archives, something which is worth bearing in mind as you post to Facebook and type emails, is that if you do things on paper, you will end up producing a record that people may want to consult in future years. I have only one final thing to show you, which is an entirely fictional representation of my parents in great old age. I never saw them sitting together reading books side by side, but a friend of ours decided that this was a nice, at least potential representation of the two of them. So you can take that as a closing point of amusement. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much for the deep explanation, and naturally we can discuss, and because we have an extraordinary, interesting guest. Thank you very much for brilliant report, for your very interesting, very important approach that is, we should be seeking much more ideas in economic theories, of course. That's the way for rethinking and for deepening understanding of the very important and very unknown processes now in our very dynamic world. Thank you, dear James. We are very. Let me invite you again in our university. We are waiting for a course or lecture because our students have big interest to your lecture, and it will be very important and interesting for us to meet you again, to discuss with you deeply, not only in a big lack of time. So please, come on again.
Хорошо. Спасибо.